Good evening, dear participants. We have now come to the third night of our webinar program. And before we proceed to our technical session, I'd like to make a few announcements and clarifications. First of all, there are some questions from some of the participants regarding the feedback forms, and these should have been clarified during the first night itself. But since we forgot to announce it in the first night, I'll have the announcement now. The feedback forms will be provided at the end of the last lecture on Friday night. After the end of the last lecture, we will issue the feedback forms, and there will be two types of feedback in the forms, two types of feedbacks in the form. The first type of feedback will be regarding the whole conduct of the webinar program. And the second type of feedback will be regarding the resource persons themselves. You will have to give separate feedbacks for each resource persons. So we will issue the feedback forms after the end of the last lecture. There will not be feedback form for every night like in some of the other webinars. And secondly, I'd like to request our respected participants to please maintain professional ethics, because in the first two nights, there are some participants who have started debates or arguments in the chat boxes. Since we are all learned individuals, as well as most of us are teachers, I would like to request you not to start any unnecessary debate or spark any unnecessary arguments, because the participants, most of the participants are teachers, but at the same time, there are some students among us. A number of students are attending this webinar from various colleges, so it doesn't seem nice if teachers are arguing or debating about some issue. So if you have any queries or any grievances about the conduct of the webinar or any issue relating to the webinar, please feel free to contact the organizers, or please send us a private message through the chat boxes. So please don't start any unnecessary debate or argument in the chat boxes, which is public and can be seen by each and every participants. And lastly, I would like to clarify again, I've already said this in the first night itself, but it seems that some of our participants are still confused about the asking the questions in the Q&A box. So I'd like to make the announcement again. If you have any questions for our resource persons, please drop your questions in the Q&A box only, because if you drop in the chat boxes, there is a great chance that our host might miss your questions. Last night also, I think we have missed out some 3 or 4 questions because you have dropped your questions in the chat box. In the chat boxes, it gets mixed up most often with the compliments and other comments from the participants. So I would like to request our respected participants again, if you have any questions, please drop your questions only in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. Okay, before I hand over the session to our resource person, I'll have a brief introduction about him. The resource person for tonight is going to be Reverend R.C. Jongtae. And Reverend R.C. Jongtae is an ordained minister under Tripura Baptist Christian Union, TBCU. He obtained his bachelor's degree under Northeastern Hill University, and he was the gold medalist in BA History Honors. And he then received his Bachelor of Divinity degree from Academy of Integrated Christian Studies, AICS, under Senate of Serampore, and he was again the gold medalist under the Senate. Reverend R.C. obtained his Master of Theology, MTH degree from University of Edinburgh, UK, and he is currently a PhD candidate, Systematic Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary, New Jersey, USA. He is also an excellent speaker and motivator, and he has been invited to deliver a number of sermons and lectures on varied topics across both the secular and theological spectrum during this lockdown period, as well as prior to the lockdown period. Above all, he is also a good friend of mine, and we stayed in the same hostel during our college days. And his topic for tonight is going to be the Church of the Poor, political but non-partisan. Sir R.C., are you ready? Okay, please, can you unmute your, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I shall now hand over to our resource person, sir. The session is now all yours.
Good evening, everyone. And it's a privilege and a great opportunity for me to be part of the esteemed panelists and to be able to have the opportunity to give my presentation tonight, which is actually morning in our part of the world. And thanks, Dr. Zarzov Sanga, for the kind words of introduction. I would not use much time for introduction or that kind of opening talks. I'm not too sure how how I should go about with my presentation. I think at least 4/5 of my preparation is in English, and but I also want to make my point clear in Mizo as well. So we will go along as the Spirit leads. So let's see how it goes. I hope both non-Mizo speaking and non-English speaking participants tonight will be able to get something out of the talk that I'm going to deliver. So as it has been as it has already been mentioned, the topic for tonight is the Church of the Poor, political but non-partisan. I would start with a screen share so that you can see my PowerPoint presentation. Give me a moment, please. Are you able to see the PowerPoint now?
Yes, it's visible, sir.
Thank you. So the topic is the Church of the Poor, political but non-partisan. I would dive right away into the topic that I'm going to talk about tonight. The study of the Christian church or the doctrine of the church in Christian theology is referred to as ecclesiology, which is the doctrine of the church. It comes from two Greek words, ek and kaleo. Ek means out of and kaleo means to call. And from these two words, we get the compound word ecclesia, which means called out or called apart. But I think we should understand this not in a sense of being called to be uninvolved in the world, but rather in Pauline terms, I think we can say that we are called to be in the world, but not of the world. Câu sanh chung chang zir na hi theology trong kama chuan ecclesiology an tia chu Greek trong atanga local ania ek ti le kaleo ti ti thumal pani kai kopa tangin ecclesia ti alo chuaka chu ko shan tia kan le lin hi ni Mizo trong kan le lin hi adik riawin ka hria I ko chua ko shan pathian in Christa a ko shan a ko chua te tina ni amma se hemi hi khovela la katanga in la sang de mo khovel ngai ven lo tura ko chua nilovin he khovela om si khovel da nga om si lo tir ko pola na ti angkha he khovel da nga om si lo chumi tura ko ran ko chua chu kan ni ti kha kan rirwa lo om ma sa sela chu ba ke zaina ka thu soi tura hian ko ran chung chang hi ko ran chung chang kha chu academic theology a kan zir thin angin ka soidon lowa enge doctrine of the church angor khan he tan lo zir to dan tiang kha ka soidon lowa ma se ko ran chung chang ko ran ni na a nature poimo tak pakhat ero chu ka soidona chu ko ran om zia sang zinga pakhat angin angai theyanga chu clear dan tur dipo ani in karinga amai ro chu asang zinga clear na om thei sang zinga pakhat ka ti rual khan apoi mo na zaina ka soitu Church of the Poor mire thei te ko ran ka ti hi apoi mo na ero chu soine pal ka hlawa clear na sang zinga pakhat ani rualin clear na sang zinga pakhat ani satli angot lawa clear na poi mo takani ko ran hi lal isua Krista ko ran tak ni tur chuan Church of the Poor mire thei te ko ran ani angai ani tin ka soidon ani. So when we look at the title, you see the Church of the Poor. I think what is important is you notice the preposition of instead of for. I'm not talking about the church for the poor. I'm talking about the church of the poor. Uh, what is significant here is for. The preposition for implies the objectification of the poor. It sees the poor as objects of charity and objects of pity, which is not bad in itself. I think we are called to be charitable to the poor, but what I want to do with the church of the poor is more than objectifying the poor. So I say the church of the poor because the preposition of points to the centrality and the agency of the poor in the church. The in the church of the poor, we get the poor as the center of the church. So that I think that distinction is quite significant here. In the previous night, Reverend Dr. Kate Hanzawa has said a lot of things that I want to say. So I think I'm going to reiterate some of the points that he had already made. So there will be convergences, and there could also be slight divergences here and there. So even if I repeat what had already been said earlier, I hope you will understand me and understand the reason why I'm doing. First, I want to go back to the passage that had already been referred to last night, and that is the passage from Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, which is usually referred to as the Nazareth Manifesto. And put differently, we can put it as Jesus's mission statement. And the statement, the passage goes like this: "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." This text is of fundamental importance, and it should not be interpreted entirely in a spiritualistic sense that has no implication for the here and the now. Our existence here on this earth as human beings enmeshed in politics. One must also bear in mind that as Jesus engages in his ministry, he lived this proclamation out and spends his life with the poor, the marginalized, and the outcast of the society. Jesus goes so far as to say that whatever you did to the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me, in Matthew chapter 25. So here we get the centrality of the poor and the marginalized, the oppressed group, in the proclamation of Jesus and in the life of Jesus as well. So I would say that the poor, the oppressed, are the central addressees of Jesus's proclamation of the kingdom of God. They are the main subjects. And this sort of divine dealing with the poor and the oppressed, the marginalized, is not something new. It's not something that's only seen in the life of Jesus Christ, but it has already been seen in a lot of Old Testament passages, like the Exodus event, where God hears the cries of the oppressed Jews. God sees their miserable plight, and God delivers them from Egyptian bondage. And we also see in the proclamations of the prophets, where they call for social justice, where they call for justice for the poor, rebuking the powerful, even kings. So we already see God's dealing with the poor and the marginalized in a number of passages in the Old Testament. And we see most explicitly and most particularly in the life of Jesus Christ. So I therefore say that Jesus is the man for the poor and the marginalized. Chantin chaluka zia punglia la li suwa Christian a mission statement he khovela aron hlen tu rapuan chuan Nazareth manifesto anti synagogue atangin apuang chuaka zolne isaile khabu bung samruk le pakhat na chang khat le chang ni na kan ti ami kha chiar chuakin mire theite ne na riang vai te ne na chanchin thashil tura pathian in a ruata wanga lalpa tharawa chunga om thu saltang te chuana thu middel ne na midwar ne na thu ti du da na tur te ne na chua tir na thu te lalpa lung oi kum thu te soi turin mitirani atia helaya chanchin tha riang vai te ne na ti hemi bible chang hi I enge tharawin a tharaw zongin a allegorical zonga I shil fi five vek maya all khop maya riang vai te chu mi ten mi del te chu mi te chu ni ti du da tur te chu tiang chu ni atia a omzia khami tharaw nu na khami omzia antinan phar te tharaw lam nun phar te kan tia I atang kai hun om vek tho kha tiang shil fi na kha a mai ro chu heng chang tam tak hi I chu tianga I atharaw zonga I shilfia five vek the ni lova a din hun a boruak an soina context an tiang chi kha kan en fia ve anga yani I kan ngai tu ave anga ya chu mi mila kan shilfia chu apoi mo ema mire theite ne na poor mire theite ne na nakina tu tenge mire theiti chu kan la soifia dona mire theite ne na chanchin thashil turin saltang te ne na chuana thu shil turin pathianin lalpa tharau chu achunga om thu la li su Krista hian asoyani he chang hi apoi mo ani te chuan pathianin exodus hunlaya exodus kan hua Israel fate torna na salutuk ahria an mitui an room thom ahria in ahmua tichuan a chan chuak ta ni ti kan hria ani I chu tiang chuan zol nei te po mei thai te re thei te chan tu nei lo te thlawang hoin an au chuaka pathian tir angin lal te po an ma chona ni chu tiang chuan pathian hi ate telama rabe telama re thei telama nuai ne chia om telama atang thina ni ti kha kan soidu ala li su Krista pe chuan heng mi te ber ta chunga inti hi ka chunga ti in ni ati tok mai ani chu wang chuan su Krista nun le a chanchin thapuan chua hian miret hei te hi alaimu anni alaimu poimo tak mai annia ra be te ne chia om te hi enge he pathian lalram chungchang puan chuan na a central addressi ava enge ava tumber ava ko berte zinga mi anni ti kha gan soidu ani ti chuan God of the oppressed riang vai tele ne chia te pathian. So I've just said that this same theme of liberation for the poor, God's option for the poor is always central. Is always a central message of the Bible, and this leads us to Latin American liberation theology. So, but before that, I want to briefly go back to the Exodus event where God delivers Israel from Egyptian bondage. We should note that this is political liberation. It's not simply about being born again or being spiritually converted. It is about a political liberation, a physical liberation of people that are in bondage, people that are oppressed, people that are marginalized, people that are dehumanized. So we should know that Exodus event, the liberation of Israel from Egyptian bondage, is an actual political liberation. It should not be simply treated as something that is to be allegorized or to be interpreted in solely spiritualistic terms, even though those interpretations are legitimate, they are valid, but they should not be simply treated as some sort of spiritualistic conversion or the sort of born again experience that we used to talk about. So I want to make that clear. Latin American liberation. I go now to Latin American liberation theology, and this is usually referred to as liberation theology or theology of liberation in the singular. And when it is used in the singular, it usually meant the liberation theology from Latin America. But it's also often used in the plural, liberation theologies or theologies of liberation, which means different strands of liberation theology. Like it can mean tribal theology, Dalit theology, feminist theology, womanist theology, Black liberation theology, all the different strands of these liberatory theologies can be included when it is used in the plural. But if it's used in the singular, it's usually used in reference to, but not always, but usually used in reference to Latin American liberation theology. And one should also be careful not to confuse this with liberal theology. The 19th century liberal theology of Europe is entirely different from the liberation theology that I'm talking about tonight. So the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church happened between the years 1962 and 1965. It was the church's attempt to respond to the needs of the modern world. So they are trying to bridge the gap between the church and the modern world. And in the council, Pope John Paul XXIII calls for the church to become the church of all, the church of the people, but particularly the church of the poor. And the spirit and the call of Vatican II was taken back to Latin America by bishops who sought to interpret the message of Vatican II in light of the Latin American experience, a context that is punctuated by massive poverty, inhuman poverty, political repression, and human rights violation. There were a series of bishops' conferences in Latin America held between the years 1955 and even as late as I think in the early 1990s. I want to mention two of these, which are particularly significant for the emergence and consolidation of Latin American liberation theology. That is the Medellin Conference in Colombia in 1968 and the Puebla Conference in Mexico in 1979. So in these conferences, they struggled a lot with the situation of Latin America. Prior to the emergence of liberation theology and these conferences, the dominant theology in Latin America for centuries and centuries is the Western theology that they inherited through the missionaries. Therefore, the modern Latin American experience was not taken seriously enough, or could not, the theology they inherited from Europe and North America could not actually address the situation of the Latin American people. Therefore, in these conferences, they try to address the situation. So Gustavo Gutierrez, who is often considered as the father of liberation theology, uh, say that in Europe, the question is about how do we address, um, particularly after the Enlightenment, how do we speak the word of God to a society that has become increasingly secular and atheistic in its beliefs? So that's the question that Europeans are struggling with. But the question that Latin American theologians, priests, and pastors are struggling with is not about atheism or agnosticism, even though those concerns are there, but it is mainly how do we speak about the love of God to people who are dying because of poverty? What does God love means for such people? So they are trying to communicate the love of God and what the love of God would mean in those particular situations. So it is a search for a relevant gospel message, a relevant theology. And therefore, these bishops' conferences are struggling with those problems and trying to address those problems. I would like to read the Medellin document on poverty, one of the important texts, and here's a brief excerpt from that document. The Latin American episcopate cannot remain indifferent to the tremendous social injustices that exist in Latin America. These injustices keep the majority of our peoples in woeful poverty, which in most cases goes so far as to be inhuman misery. A muted cry wells up from the millions of people, begging their pastors to provide them with a liberation that they cannot get from anywhere. So the people are crying. There's this muted cries from millions of people who are in woeful poverty, inhuman misery, and therefore they are crying out to God and to their pastors, like to liberate from them from this inhuman misery, because they could not get such sort of liberation from anywhere else. So this is the situation they are in. So the priest, many of the priests and many of the bishops and the church leaders could not turn away from these cries, could not look at the plight of the people with indifference. They think that they have to get involved with the people, be with the people, and provide what they need. In light of the inhuman poverty and the wretched condition in which majority of the Latin American population live, priests and theologians reread the Bible, reinterpret central Christian doctrines, like the doctrines of sin, salvation, Christology, the doctrine of God. And ecclesiology is one such doctrine that is reformulated. Hence, liberation theology was born in the 1960s and early 70s. In order to address this specifically Latin American experience of suffering, poverty, injustice, and inhuman misery. It is in this context that Gustavo Gutierrez published his groundbreaking book, A Theology of Liberation, History, Politics, and Salvation, that was published in 1973. So this book is often understood as the book that really kick off liberation theology as an academic discipline that has real impact and significance for not only in the academia but for the life of everyday people. So, and liberation theologies should not be understood as a new theology, but should be seen rather as a new way of doing theology. Like they hold on to, liberation theologians hold on to all the like, let me put it this way, they still see the significance of all the like the traditional Christian doctrines, like the doctrine of God, the doctrine of sin, salvation, whatever. But in light of the Latin American experience, they think that many of those dominant theologies have to be critiqued, have to be supplemented, and therefore there needs to be a reformulation in order to address Latin American situation, which is similar to, in important ways, similar to the experience in different part of the so-called third world countries. So this is not necessarily a new theology, but more of a new way of doing theology. Hence, methodology becomes very important for liberation theology. Let me stop here for a moment, and then let me state what I've stated so far in Mizo briefly. Let me try to state that briefly. Liberation theology kan ti hi liberal theology ti nen a in anglawa chu ngai pol lo turania theology of liberation ti tenan soi china chu Latin America tang ron cho kania ma se he theology noya hian theology chi sang tam tak black theology and ti te tribal theology dalit theology ti te khang ang tam tak he theology noya hian a khung theya theologies of liberation ti te point a plural angin an soi kerthin ani chunia chumia ron chu he thil hi ron chuana chana oma chuti ringota enge anron ti thar thu ta mo ani lo achana omani aphe na he theology anga kalphung theology kalphung thar anron ti chuana chani oma sanga ko somruk pahni atanga somruk panga inkara Second Vatican Council and the Roman Catholic enge kausan rorel lian tak mai khovel ho goma khovel mun sang atangin an kal khoma Vaticana chu rawan rela chumia chuan Pope John Paul som ni pathumna hian chuan kausan hi mi zong kausan ni tura kan buat sai thar le a tin ambi takin mire theite kausan ni tura kan buat sai le ngai ni ti in chungwa te po chona soya ma se Vaticana chuan Church of the Poor mire theite kausan ti chungchanga hian official document an siam an nei lo thungani an siam tel lo a thleng phalo ni chu ma se soi lo tak ero chu ani chu mi Vatican Council Roman Catholic kausanina tumber chu khovel lo changkang zela hian engtin nge kausan le modern society he tun lai khoveli engtin nge kan relate theyang engtin nge kausan hian modern society tun lai khovel hne na hian thua soyang ti zon antum ber pakhat ani chu mi tum na chu ne ti chuan an tia chu Vatican Council atang chuan Latin America tanga bishop hantel ho te po an hole ta chuan an mani hmuna an ngai tu ta ni engtin nge kan ti ang ni Latin America khovela hian he kan chen na mun kan ram kan continent a hian engtin nge chanchin tha kan puanang chanchin thom zia chu enge ni ang ti in an ni pon an ngai tu ani ti chuan chu an din mun chu enge kan ti chuan sipai sarkar ten bet tak main mi puyan opa death squad an ti hawin mi puya an thatami asang sing tel heng hun chung chho hian chung dictator ho chuan an thata mi pui tamzok an re thei em maya chu tiang din huna chuan an tinga ti chuan heng hun lai hian Latin America Bishop Conference nge an pass an pui thiam te conference poimo tak an neya Medina te Puebla te chuan chung zo na har sat tak mai chu engtin nge he boro ka hian pathian mangai na kan puanang gospel he mi ta tan hian enge ni ang chan chin tha chu enge ni ang ti in an ngai tua ti chuan mi pui tuara room thom chu an hoi san thei to lova pathian in Israel fa te trap le room an turna a hriat sak ang khan chung ko hran hruai tu te po chuan mi pui turna room chu hoi san theya beng chut ngon san theya an ngai to lova te chuan chung ang din boruak sang sang chuan I Hair liberation theology kan ti hi aron ti chuak ta ti chuan chu an ma ani nge tuarna le har sat na enga tang chuan Bible an zirnon le a Bible an chiar thar le a doctrine an lo nei to sa Europe theology an hoin missionary hoin I Christian doctrine chandam na thu sual thu an pek zong te an zirnon le a e khai tam tak hi chu Europe ho hian context big lawin khovel tan theology kan ti mo anin tia ma se han en chuan an theology hi an ma ni na khovelin a hrin chu tam takalo ve tho mai chuwang chuan theology zong hi a contextual vekani theology zong hi en context emoni ina a hrin vekani I khovel pum huwa patana chanchin thalai mu pom tlan theichin enge chu tiang chu om rualin chu chanchin tha lan chua dan kan hriat thiam dan kan man tangkai dan tu chu kan context hian thui takin kan omna khovel kan seilen na kan thanlen na kan chen na khovel hian kan namte kan harsat na to te heng te hian alo hrilani ti an hu chuaka Europe theology an ro pui in khovel ai o a ke ni chu eng ma context ina ti buailo I khovel huwa pa ngai tu anga theology an tiang kha anilo European mingau pa ngai to in economic din muna po din mun thadeu te khovel op tu te din mun ni chunga an ngai to theology lo ni thau mai ti an mu chuaka Latin American theology po liberation theology po an ma ni context an chen na khovel le amma mo ina hrin chu ania chu tiang che chon Europe po lo ni ve thau mai thui tak chu alo ni vek mai theology hi every theology is contextual chu soi po ngai to lova thudik omsa tautology anti hial ani chu ta chuan he Latin American liberation theology hi chu din huna chuan I aron chuaka theology thar I ro pui tak nilovin theology ti dan thar theological phung thar ani berzok ani chu ti chuan salvation chandam na chung chang doctrine te anhan hril fianon le Bible kha mi tharin an zuzira ama a Europe theology than nan pui manga an mu thiam lo tam takha an zu mu thiam tani lali suwa thu cha lai mu hi pathian lalram chung chang lo ni reng mai chu isu kana hril berani ti te isu kha mi re theite bula akhosaka a omna sabzia te an soyani an muda aman mu thiam lo European ho chuan ti te anga ol samzong in soi top topila European ho chuan I pathian kha I enge modern khovela modern period anti nu hemi enge colonialism in chan chong nu a chuan an ma ni chakna le theina enga tangin pathian thuan thira ramdang opte continent dang va opte salaman te kha an tharau kan chandam na turalom chanchin thra kan ti darna lom I pathian in khovel hi enge civilized tu civilized tir tu ti changkang tu ni turin min tir ni ti inchu pathian thu kha chu tiang zo mitnen chon an thira an zira an kalpuya ma se liberation theology an hotele an ma ni liberation theology an big chawan ni lo mi dang tam tak pon nia Bible an chiar an han zira European mingau chung nung khovel rabbet tu ina Bible a mu theilo a chiar chua theilo a mu thei mi lo tam tak an zu mu chuak lat mai ni Bible thulai mu le zirtir na poimo tak tak ve ni sia kha chu Reverend Dr. K Thanzawan ni zana I nuam satak eisen lo nei chunga chokko puara om chunga Bible chiar le real tram ei tur nei lovina Bible chiar chu a chiar ta na inang lo ani ati ang deuh khan nia I chu mi tang chuan he theology hi he Latin American liberation theology kan ti hi I aron chuak ta ni chu ni china ka soi khai Gutierrez I Peru ram theologian ania Dominican priest ania Theology of Liberation, History, Politics, and Salvation, ti le kabu sangka zako somsari pathuma aron tichoka. Hey, liberation theology, enge aron chu anaturata na le khab a in na le kabu poimo berte zingami ani le kabu ale kalan le kabu masa ani a subtitle here and cherula History, Politics, and Salvation ti ani. To me, tangchuan theology na ahoy tur kha ashriat ngala liberation ti po hi salvation ti lukina chiar theya amai ro chu salvation ti chu chandam na ti chu kharau chandam na chu angangai aloni rei to lu tuka chu wang chuan liberation ti trong kam mang hian kharau chandam na chu anilo mishing nun pum chandam na ani ti lai kha political liberation potelani ti kha ron wartumin itu tiang chuan hele khabu hi aron ti chuak ta ani. Now this takes us to the preferential option for the poor. I think I need to go faster. I'm worried that I'm going to take too long. I haven't even started talking about the Church of the Poor. Preferential option for the poor. How do I start to talk about this one? Preferential option for the poor hi rethei te ne chia te lama trang pathian in chumilam te chu rethei te lama on big ti na ani deuh beranga nakina hei kala soifia dona k big ne ti ne na ro cho ne nang lo ni ti lai kha in lo no done. So this preferential option for the poor is one of the main themes of liberation theology. It simply means that God preferentially opts for the poor. So preference does not mean that God, it does not deny God's universal love. It still agrees and totally hold on to the idea that God's love is universal. And it is specifically because of the universal nature of God's love that this preference becomes important. This may sound paradoxical or ironical or whatever, but this is true because in order to really make God's love universal, you need to particularize it. There needs to be a preference for those whose lives matter less. So preference denotes what comes first. And here, the poor comes first. Option here does not mean optional. Whether like depends on your whims and your likes and dislikes, whether like I opt not to do it or I opt to do it. Like it's not that kind of option. It doesn't mean optional. It means, in the Spanish, it means decision making. It means deciding to be in solidarity with the poor. So it's not something that's optional that you can or cannot choose. It is something that calls for a decision to be in solidarity with the poor. And who are the poor? Simply put, the poor are the non-persons, those people who are invisible in the society, the people who are insignificant, marginalized, people, to use Gutierrez's term and Enrique Dussel. These are the people who are on the underside of history. So that is what is meant by preferential option for the poor. And I'll go a bit deeper on poverty. Poverty, I've related the theological, the context in Latin America, the socioeconomic political context of Latin America. And so what is important for Latin American liberation theologians and for theologians who are into liberation theology is that poverty is no longer a solely a socioeconomic problem. It's not simply about social justice. It's a theological problem. This is really crucial. It's a theological problem because poverty ultimately means death, unjust and premature death. To be poor means to die early because you have no access to healthcare facilities, because you have no access to good food, because you have no access to humane and decent standard of living. Poverty means death. Therefore, it is a theological problem. If we understand, if we think that liberation theology is like too much into sociopolitics and therefore like it's not that. Why they are so interested and invested in this in this issues is that they see it as a theological problem. Because at the end of the day, poverty is inhumane. It is anti-evangelical, which means it is against the gospel. It is not evangelion. It is not good news. It is anti-good news. Therefore, poverty is a theological problem for liberation theologians. And there are three notions of poverty: material poverty, which is also referred to as economic poverty or real poverty. That means you don't have access to resources that would enable to live humanely. And there's this spiritual poverty. And also the third kind of poverty is poverty as commitment to the poor. This is what we are called to do. This is what the church is called to do. So poverty as commitment to the poor. So these three notions, these three understandings of poverty is very important for liberation theology. So this is what Gutierrez says. Poverty is a human question, a Christian question, because poverty is death. It is inhuman. It is anti-evangelical. Theologians, among them my friends, will say, I know that you are very concerned with poverty because you are a Peruvian. I reply, no, my friend, I am concerned because I am a Christian. Like, people are assuming that people like Gutierrez are interested in poverty because he comes from a poor country that in South America, that is Peru, and people are poor there. Therefore, he cares a lot about poverty. But Gutierrez's reply is, no, I am concerned because I'm a Christian. It is a Christian question. It is a theological question, because poverty means that it is inhuman. It is anti-evangelical. I think I agree with that. So now, this gets us to the Church of the Poor. So in light of what had been said so far, the Church of the Poor should denounce poverty and injustice, should preferentially opt for the poor, makes the poor the central subjects of church. The Church of the Poor should listen to the voice of the poor and being converted by them and toward them. The Church of the Poor should proclaim integral salvation, which is holistic salvation that encompasses spiritual salvation and political liberation. The Church of the Poor is the crucified church, not a crucifying church. The Church of the Poor is a church of the cross, not a church of glory. I would elaborate these points in Mizo. So the Church of the Poor must denounce poverty and injustice. The Church of the Poor miret hei te cầu shan. Miret hei te ta na cầu shan mai ni lo. Miret hei te cầu shan. Miret hei te alaya mun poi mo ada tu cầu shan. Miret hei ten din mun cha an lu na cầu shan. Chu cầu shan chu la li su Krista cầu shan dik chu anitur ani in ke chuan ka shria. Chu mi ni chuan cầu shan chu cầu shan miret hei te cầu shan chu miret hei te va khong in thom no va pek ringot ani to lo ni chu charity ringot ani to lo philanthropy ringot ani to lo. I chung chu a tha kan ti ve tur po ani e kan ti zelang I ai war pon kan latia am mai ro chu voina hen apoi mo ta chu heng miret hei Latin America miret hei anti te mi pui tam zo kha an re thei ringot mai ni a hausa ten hausa em line chu da chuan an mu chua chu heng miret hei te hi thatchiar wang re thei an ni lo thatchiar wang re thei chun lo om pal mai thei heng mi re thei te hi an ma ni fel lo le thiam lo wanga re thei an ni ringon lo an re thei na chan omani chan enge mo wangin an re thei ani chu kan son chuangai ni ti kha alo ni ta ni chu wang chon ani Marxist analysis an ti te sociological analysis an ti te an man na chan chu Marx an chiara hemi tang hian gospel ngai tu te anga an ti lo Latin American din hunan ena Europe din hun ten ria Vatican Council atang in ngai tu na lo thara ma point an ngai tu an alo om to chung chu chui tu ti chon Vatican Council atang in alo lian thara an hoa an mani borong din hunan ngai tu a chanchin tha an zir le a Bible an chiar non le a ret theina chungchang te pathian chungchang te la liso Christa chungchang te an chiar non le a chumi atang chuan ret hei na hi mi ret hei te ni lovin ret hei na hi pathian du lo zong ani ti an hu chuaka ti chuan ret hei na om zia man turin Karl Marx atena class struggle an ti te chumi Marxist social analysis nge socialist hawina society nge mi ret hei le ho sa in kar an zuman na turata na an man ruwa kha an mang chau zo kani chu Marxism kha an starting point anilowa chanchin tha awangin chanchin tha pui tuwa man ruan mang chau ni chu pathian le mi pui te tan man ruan mang ani chu man ro thaber ani le ni lawero chu a debate thayang chu amai ro chu Marxist commitment awanga he liberation hiron ti nge he theology hiron ti chuak an ni lo te ro kha chu kan soi chiang du ani ti chuan mi re thei te chu tia chu tan pui mai ni lovin re thei siam chuak tu call hi system hi enge ni kan hriat angai khoi tang ron chok nge ti kan hriat angai German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer an tia enge hemi rel na dik lo kal phung fel lo kha avira kal muaya tolai lir ke angin aspok in kara a huila chuan ka thi adin na turin thil kan rol nga mangai ni tia mi tuya an tlamaya ti khan an lo char an lo chan chuak le thina chan chuak kha thareng ma se eng vai nge hi lama lui nar lama khian nga tinge mi tuya an tlak reng na chan ti kha chui chuanga ani chu liberation theology hian I atum pakhatania rethei de tran puya du tok lawa an rethei chan mu chuwa chumi ti topa system thazo equitable zo more humane gospel ne na in mil zok system economic system society kalphung khovel kalphung ramro de na kalphung azong ani chu charity ang kalpui kha atok to lova rethei an om claim thei na tur ber khovel khasiam tum zok turani ti chuan enge chandam na tluantling huap zo as chumi rethei te ko hran chona puang chuak turani an nun pum ma khoi turani chatuan nun na chang tura sualaga kan chandam na apoi mo ber hei hi kan soibo lova soibo chin ni lova kan soi rengang ma se chandam na hi hemi china hian atop lovani I chumi chin chau chu anilo I ti kha he khovela kan ni tin nu na hi a khoi telani ti te he kan taksa hi khoi telani ti te chu kan hriat angai ni chu wang chon chu Europe ba kan an le leila industrial revolution aron thleng chowa a ho sa le emi a working class ho ten in khau na sata ema chu da chon chu Marx te bok chon an ron zira khai hei mi puiten an mani din hun ti thatur an de lo na chan hi sa khuana wang ani Christian an ni maya chu hun lai chuan Europe chuan de berana sa khuana wang ani sa khuana hian mihringte a rui hlawangina a thokani he khovelan ngai tu theilo an mani chora an hausak ve an nom sakna tur lak sak tu ten an mani sor fu vek tum tu ten pathian nangi chu van ramai lan nuam don alo mantia an pastor ten chu mi hausa hawina an roi an chor hlon pe khauten mi puiten hena khovel hi chu eng mani lo tin van lam hoyan zirtira van rama kan lan nuam don an tia chu wang chon sa khona I nokani an ron ti na chan pakhat bul pui khani ma se ke ni chuan hantila liberation theology an chuan ngoite pu Marx in mu phak in hun lai Europe mingo ho I Bible zirtir na le pathian thuan zirtir na I atang chuan ingai dan hi a om khop mai I chumi awang chuan I sakhona do zong Christian na do zong in nang chuan I thui soya amai ro chu keini chuan Bible a nge hian he khovela in hoitir dan hi oma nakin hun hlam chia si lawa he khovel hun ngai poi mo dan hi Bible hian min zirtira chu chu isuanuna te chandam na omzia te kan mu ani tin Christian na ban san zong lovin Bible mangin Mark sa te ti tum kha ti kan tum ve ani chu I chu tiang zong chuan chu kan kal pui thiam chuan tu na he webinar an thu pui ber secular sacred church le secular sa khuana le nitin nun hemi nge ko shan le pon lam chumi in then phuk mai po chu integral salvation enge chandam na afam kim zok a huap zau zok a hriat thiam chuan thui tak I asui zom thein ka hria chu I ti bok tur ani in ka hria ti chuan englo mira thei te ko hran chu crucified church ania crucifying church alo I mi te kheng bet tu tina tu ti hliam tu ko hran ani lova Christa khen be na trompui tu ko hran ani Church of the Cross ko hran ania I Church of Glory ro puina atui hal ko hran ani lo mira thei te ko hran chu Martin Luther and Theology of the Cross le Theology of Glory aron khai kina Theology of Glory chuan ro pui na san na thil ti theina tangin pathian a zonga pathian hria da tuma thil sang thil ro pui atangin ma se Theology of the Cross ve thungero chuan thil klom le mu sit om mang a pathian a zonga tuar na cross a pathian a mutlat mai ni chu Theology of the Cross anti epistemology of the cross te pontia I thil klom le thil mu sit om manga I pathian mu theina ani I pathian vazon na ani ni zana soilan ni to atira chon Christian te minority an nia marginalized a society margin an oma an din huna chia ti du dan to ka re thei takin an oma train an plan chi an wak waya ma se kum zabi palina chawa Constantine ron lala khovela lo danglam ma ngai saka om thin te kha ro rel na chel tu nitlat mai ni society si ra he ta I enge mual kila om thin ho kha I lal in kil tu te khami kha anron ni tlata chu Christian na hian tuarani thui takin sa khuana ang chuan Christian na aro pui pha ma se Christian na in engchen nge lal isua Christa nung azui pha ti ro chu debate thama omin ga hria ti chuan lal du saknan lo chanta ka wangin a hun lai lal ram ro pui ber du saknan lo chanta ka wangin thil ti theina le ro puina nen Christian chu ti khana local kopa achung nung ta em ma sa khodang te mi dang tin reng te ra bea khatiang kha I adu to ro puina Christianity of the cross Christian ani to lovin Christianity of glory kal to tha wangin ti chuan triumphalistic Christianity kan tiang kha lo ding chang ta zoka aro puile thil ti thei zo in ko thana lokala chu vo in thleng hian Christian le ko thran kan hriat thiam dan chu chuan ngong in ke chuan ka hria biakin kan in sakro puisia ka ko thran ten society le politics a denomination sang ten power te kan in chu te poni mai the ko thran chunga member ten I kan in ro puina le thune ina le san na kan in chu boka hausa te poisa tho tam theite khovel million le mi ro puite chu ko thran in angai ro puya ro puina zong ko thran ani tlata wangin chu ro puina nei tu chuan mi hring ro pui ko thran ina ma mo asum le pa yam mo tlatani chu wangin mi re theile chan hai ne chia te isua VIP te kha voin ko thana hian VIP ni ngai na om talo ni chu Church of Glory ani tlat o wangin ro puina ko thran rau pui na zong biak in nei rau pui chumi khamine rau pui chumi zong in Church of the Poor chu a modest tu rani mire thei te ko ran chu a u chuak le hlei luak taka engma ti lovin mire thei te re thei na tom pui in huama in ngai tlom le a enge sang u chuak lo taka khosa ani tu rani rau rel na dikte mire thei te thlawang ho sang na te tel lovin tharau mi ko ran mi ni kan tuma ko ran mi tha chu kan ni mai thei sa khomi tha po kan ni mai thei ama ero chu i swan hnung zui tu tha kan ni phaim ti ero chu i ngai tu thamo mani hetianga khovel ro puina le sana zong ko ran kan ni chuan corruption dik lo zia te hi soi soi mai la om zia om mo hlein ka ring tlata a chan chu i khang mi te sum kha ro puina zong ro puina thalel ko ran chuan a du tlat mai ani chu kan trong ka in do dal mai la Church of Glory kan ni na kha system kha kal phung khan i le lama chuan a di khang sum kha amamo tlat mai ni a ka soi na salutuk mai thei ka khelo chu ko ran church chung changa Church of the Poor ka ti po ka ngai poimo te zinga mi ani ve a chu tiangin mitam takin Christian na chu khovel lal tele lal ram ro pui te thil ti theina manga hum him kan tum me Constantine tang to khan chu alian laklo to alian te thawang ho na hnuaya midang nek chepa lian le ro pui taka triumphalistic Christianity kal pui kha I Christian na chung nung lup mai kal pui kha kan thiam pui laklo to lali suwa Christa khan ro pui na thil ti theina le hlau om na mangin alal ram din du sela chuan vana si pai te ko thatheya van tir ko te ko thatheya ma se chu ti zong chuan Isu Krista khan alal ram hum hi mo alal ram din tum ngai lo ma se chuan lal ram de lal ro pui te manga hum him kan tum ta Christian chuan powerful te min soi sel tir ngam to lova thutlung hlui ko khrante thutlung hlui zol nei te lal le thil ti thei tu te ma a huai sen taka nang ma hi inia ti sual tu chun ti ngam lain ke ni chuan lal na te thu nei na te ro pui na te ho sak na te chu min hum him tu tur min tikal tu ra kan ngai tlat to awangin we can no longer speak truth to power huai sen na kan nei to lo unholy alliance chu ro pui na le thil ti theina nen chuan in zon na thiang hlim lo kan neya chuan lali suwa Krista ko hrante hi min bumem ti hi ngai tu chian poimo ani ka top trep Bartolome de las Casas oma Spanish missionary sangkhat zanga ti chawami englo Spanish ho kon englo ram la tu te khan an hruai ve a khuda Latin America lama ti chuan Spain lalram atana tho thada wangin Indian native mo khami aram nei tu salatan te po sor kharina pevea ti chuan chung ho mang chuan nge huan te siama ti chuan lunglu nge rangka chak laina te a beve ti chuan ati vea tum khat chu mi pakhathi ane na ron kala mi hausa neng chu khami Spain official lamani karing ane na ron kala ti chuan lalpa zan ri sakramena omna lama buat sai sakturin aron nge na ti chuan na vakala buat sai sakama se buat sai sakdona ma se buat sai sakturin ma se ecclesiasticus bung som thum palian tia chu Roman Catholic Bible a chon atela Protestant canon Bible a chon tel velwa chumi chu achiara mire thei nen atanga ruk sak chu in thoina tlingani lo zia te in zia ka chumi a chuan ti chuan lalpa zan ria sacrament thiang hlim chu mire thei nen atanga chang ruk sak manga buat sai thei ani lo ti mu chuaka chu in thoina chang chu mire thei te tho rimna atanga lak sakani awangin ne chu an ni awangin thisen akaya ni mire thei te thisen akaya ni ti amu choka apiang tharani chu ti chuan Latin America a missionary le khatiang zinga po Indians how mo khuta sal how te a native mi aram mi te thawang how na saber tu le chumia adam chung hun mangra chuani chu voina hian keini Isua Christa ko ran Christa tak sapeng te hian chu thi sen chu kan kai ve em thi sen kai chung khan pathian ne na chung thi sen mire theite thi sen na luan te chu in thoina tan kan man chuan lalpa tan pongtla kan ilova abela thi sen pathian ne na au cho gang khan chu mire theite thi sen chu enganga in thoinan polo mangin thiro puiti nan mang maila sa khuana thorong tak nei lo pathian ta na lom tlak lo mai ni don ani chuwang chuan Church of the Poor mire theite ko ran member thani turin pian tharna pathian le kan then om mire thei kan vengte chu pian tharna van lam hoi le he khovel hoi chu vertical le horizontal conversion chu kan mamo le ke po hian ni tin kamo kan vine kan mamo voi khata nei thei pon ni lo chu mi konga conversion chu i ni tin i ti thu ka nei thar turin i kan tana mire thei te thawang ho saka au chuak tu re thei te mangai na le an re thei chan hu khotu i chu ania chu wang chuan ani Church of the Poor chu a political lo thei lo na chan political chu a political na chan chu politics chu sarkar na te i power relations hemi mishing le group in kara in lai chin na te I engtin nge resources kan in semang ti chungchang te khatiang te governance chungchang te nia chuwang chon Church of the Poor chu a political lo thei lo ani mire thei te lama tran tlata wangin dik lo na te injustice te I inequality te a fight angai tlata wangin I a political lo thei lo ani chu a neutral thei lo Desmond Tutu ti hanatia sain fang mi rap sain sazua rap beti muwa chuan ral khata tang ni lo thira chuan ral khata tang lo thri chuan sazu hne na ke chu ka neutral e ka in rol don lo ti la sazu kati sazu chuan in neutral na kha chu ngai sang lo khopang ate injustice chungchanga chuan neutral om theilo ro rel na fel lo le in ra be na chungchang in hnuai che na chungchanga chuan tu ma neutral theilo ra be telamai tran lo chuan ka trong chua lo chuan rab bet tu lama ka tang ti nani a chan chu in ra be na din hun ti dang lam turin engma ka ti lo wangin in rab bet chun zom ma se poi ti lo tuk kani chu wang chuan neutral a om theilo wani I Church of the Poor chu a political ani chu mi zong chuan amma ero chu a non-partisan thung non-partisan kan ti na chan chu I party politics arui chil lawa tu ne na ma I enge in tiam enge an condition om lawin I rin om na ahlan theilo I khovel chung party le chung organization nen chuan distance in kara in siama atul huna chuan e hei chuan pathian ram hnai deu ti na support mai thei ma se a party anga varui chilna le khatiang anga tuinu wa in bol na kha om theilo I chu I apoi mo hlein ka hria a neutral theilo ani chu ani non-partisan kan ti na chana kha I party politics rui chil kan tiang chi chu I hemi political party kan ti ringot lo po hi an mai thei I chungang chu I apoi mo hlein ka hria chu entinan I German Nazi hun line Germana state ko ran state ina pompui sarkar ina pompui le confessing church a pompui lo hoan oma chungang chi te chu voina hian atul huna chuan Church of the Poor mire theite ko ran chuan I thil dik lo out chua pui manghama pathian VIP mire theite lama atana chung mi te chu ko ran lai mu mi poimo asiam ngam I asiam theya chu tiang tu chuan aliana tele aro puyate kantol kiana an kan tu po ni la in ti tet ngam I apoimo hle in ka hria te chuan chu non-partisan but political church kan ti chun helai te hi sap trong in claim kan soileng e khanan. So the church of the poor is political but non-partisan. Political encompasses governance, the relationship, the power relations between individuals and groups, and the distribution of resources and such stuff. So if the church of the poor is to be on the side of the poor, and if it preferentially opts for the poor, it cannot remain apolitical. It cannot remain neutral. It has to stand against injustice. It has to stand against poverty. It has to take a stance against oppression. Therefore, it will always be political, but it would never be partisan. It should remain non-partisan. By non-partisan, I mean it does not pledge uncritical and unconditional allegiance to a particular political party, because it has only one Lord, that is Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is the only one who is worthy of unconditional allegiance, surrender, and worship. The church maintains this stance from and abstains from forming unholy alliances with political parties and career politicians in contradiction to the gospel. Gospel kal zonga party politics nena in zom amo I inne amo I bollokai aremlo ani chu. So I end with this quote between of the relationship between the church of the poor and the state. The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. The church must be reminded that it is not the master or servant of the state, but the conscience of the state. I think this is where the church of the poor should stand. Go run to Rorel tu te emo sorkar chia lo emo. Sorkar tungaleng ho tu sorkar kal pung tu shil tu anilava. Sorkar Rorel tu te tana chia le chasliat na kong diko mu tu aniturani. Chumi chona support huna support anga adaw dal huna chon hoi sen takin atrongam turani. Guide le critique ani kop turani tinani chu manrua tan man turan lo hey Martin Luther King Jr. soenia poi mo len ka ria hey ko ran le rorel na in lai chin na chung changa poi mo len ka ria khati khani te se hun kala rei shet dar kar khatchunga hun thun tum kania dar kar khat ka per shetem o katia khami chen khani sela ti chuan englo Q&A ate englo achiang tok lo chukan in Zodonia. The church of the poor is unapologetically political because it believes in the God of the oppressed, in the God who becomes poor and take human form, but at the same time it remains non-partisan when it comes to pledging allegiance to earthly political organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend RC, for that inquisitive and thought-provoking session. And sir, you have some questions in the Q&A box. If you can please access it from the bottom of your screen. I'll read out the questions for the participants, and you'll answer each question. Okay, so the first question is, you mentioned that poverty is anti-gospel and anti-evangelical. At the same time, prosperity theology also teaches us the same thing. Can you tell us the difference between the two? That is the first question.
This is actually a great question. I was not aware of this line of reasoning previously, but I think it's been a few months since that I've become aware of this line of reasoning. But that's why, like, I said this to some friends some time ago. Like, in some sense, I think I'm being more I'm being more like sympathetic toward prosperity gospel than I was before, like in a jolly manner. I was not. I'm not serious, of course, but yeah. So I think the difference lies in that it is not a search for the theology of liberation, or the talk against poverty is not does not arise out of the desire for affluence, or out of desire for affluence or luxury or comfort as such. It's a search for justice, actually. So it never prosperity or luxury, material prosperity or luxury is never the goal or the end of liberation emphasis on the search for dignity and well-being. And that's far from it, because at the end of it calls it calls the rich, the powerful, individually or as a group, to join in the poverty of the people in the church, and to be poor with Jesus Christ. So I think like the starting point and the end is like rather hugely different between prosperity gospel and the fight against poverty we find in liberation theologies.
Okay, so I think that satisfies the gist of the question. The next question is the word poor. Sorry, yeah, the word poor does not confine only to financially poor, but also implies politically and socially poor as well. So if we ask ourselves who are the poor in Mizoram, by this definition, the poor could be the non-Mizos like Chakma, Bru, and Vai. So my question is, if we are going to establish the Church of the Poor in Mizoram, do you think that we have to change our attitude towards these people? That is the second question.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned this in my presentation. It might not be as clear as I wanted it to be because I was like in a bit of a hurry. Yes, the poor is not confined. The meaning of the poor or poverty is not confined to the financially poor. Therefore, I give my understanding of like the poor as insignificant person in the non-persons. But I also feel that we cannot simply we should not to relativize the importance of economic poverty too quickly. I would like to stress that part. But that being said, poverty is not confined to material poverty. I agree with that. And if we are going to establish the Church of the Poor in Mizoram, do you think that we should have change our attitude, which assumes that are the prevalent attitude right now is not in line with the gospel or in line with the concept of the Church of the Poor? And if that's the case, I think we should change, definitely.
Okay, sir, the third question is, sir, if you think every theology is considered contextual, should religious truth propagated by theology differ from one place to another?
No, I don't think so. This brings us to the question of contextuality and Catholicity, which theologians talk a lot about. So every theology is contextual does not necessarily mean that we can twist the truth of the gospel in any ways we like. There's this core message of the gospel, I believe, and sometimes people might disagree, and there might be debates and contestations. But there's a belief, a core belief in our faith that is common to like Christians around the world. But how we express that truth, how we live out that truth, or how we communicate that truth could be different, contextual. So there's always this contextuality, the contextual part and the universal part, the Catholic part. Catholicity and contextuality are always like, I think there could be tension sometimes, but it could be maintained in a healthy way.
Okay, proceeding to the next question. Do you think homosexuality can be included in the category of the so-called poor, as they are deemed as insignificant and marginalized by the contemporary society? And as one of the three notions of poverty is spiritual poverty, there are some who are born a little less manly and some a little less womanly, psychologically and physically. As the Church of the Poor denounces injustice and focuses on the universality of love, in your opinion, is it a high time to break the rigid walls of churches, but let God be the standard of love? After all, it is a crucified church, not the church of glory. That is the question.
Yes. Let me just look at the question again.
Okay,
sorry.
no problem.
Okay, as the Church of the Poor denounces injustice and focuses on the universality of love, in your opinion, is it high time to break the rigid walls of churches? Yeah, God should be the standard of love. I definitely agree with that. And if the homosexuals are among the poor, and marginal, and it depends. Like, so, let me put it this way. The definition of poverty, in some sense, can also be contextual, I think, even though there are those constants. Because, like, let me put it this way: the mesos can belong to the poor in our relationship to the government of India or mainland Indians or the Indic Indians. But we might not belong to the poor if we look solely inside Mizoram, because we are the dominant group there. In that case, even homosexuality, I think it depends. It can depend, and looking at the world broadly, and I think that they are marginalized. They are marginalized, and in that sense, they could be poor, and I think this is one of the reasons why the first generation liberation theologians are criticized by theologians of, let's put it this way, sexuality, because they do not include homosexuals or other people in the category of the poor. I think this is one of the criticisms alleged against liberation theologians of the yeah.
Okay, next question. Oh, sorry,
yeah.
sorry. Okay, continue.
I think that's it.
Okay. So this question is asked in Mizo language. So I'll give the liberty to a resource person to answer whether in English or in Mizo. Depends on his own choice. The question is, Mizoram ko hante hi Church of the Poor hanti tur hi ka khelom lem lowa kami malu ngai dan ningot lo de hian azira zir chien de hi athayem zir chien na te hi a rengem. That is the question.
Zir chien na chu ka shelava enge lela ma chon Church of the Poor tia ka soikha conceptual ang reng te umayania zir chiang don tai la engtin nge kan zir chianang khati zong khan ka import sai na hang ka ngai to tel lawa I enge ka tun chop le chila ka ngai to na ka soi mayanga I enge definitive de ulowin zir chiang don tai la engtin nge kan zir chian dan tur nia ka ngai chu I enge ko shan chel vak le che zia changte ko shan mi zia changte I ko shan ro rel na kal phung le khatiang te resource of mandante khanga tang ka chuan zirchian thei chu omanga ma amma ero chu statistics ang taka heti chen hi 60% church of the poor and 40% church of glory and ti ang chuan a har karing amai ro chu chung ang ko shan ni phung le mi je sang sang clear khan thui tak chu ko shan ge church of the poor and le ni lo kha va mu thei chu om karing in mute
Oh, sorry.
oh
Okay, so this is another question in Mizo. The question is, Church of the Poor isoyang tak hi atak takin thei ni ringem. That is the question.
afam kim lawanga ma se thui taka om thei karinga tuna a church of the poor ang zong lo pon tuna ko shan po kan fam kim chong lo ta amai ro chu kan ni na tur kan ni dan tur pathian du dan tur ni ti kan in shriata kan in poma chu ideal chu goal chu picture ne chunga kan kal chuan voin aya thafe chon kan ti thei karing amai ro chu afam kim ang zong chon ti thei lo pathian in nang ni chu ka duang tak fam kai social bo ko ranin ne atiang tur chon kanom lo wanga ma se we can definitely become more oriented toward or in becoming the church of the poor.
Okay. The next question is, do you think the notion of white supremacy has its roots in Christianity? What's your take on the BLM, Black Lives Matter?
I think this could be a little complex, and I let me be clear. I am of the opinion that Christianity contributes a lot to the idea of white supremacy. That much I will make it. I don't know whether it is the root as such, but it contributed a lot. But of course there are also so many other things at play. But Christianity is complicit, and it has to repent, I think. And my take on BLM is that I believe Black Lives Matter.
Okay. Yeah. If you want to say something, sir, am I interrupting? Sorry.
There are. So I should have mentioned this in my talk. Like when I say partisan, I also mean not only political parties like BJP, MNF, or Congress. I also mean conservatives, liberal divide. I also mean left-wing, right-wing divide. Like these ideological camps, which are at war with each other. There's an impasse that you cannot overcome. It's simply like people are at war and talking past each other. No one is listening to each other anymore. So it's that kind of partisanship that hinders us to look for justice, to look for the common good, to look for truth, to search for truth. So that kind of like that kind of partisanship. And with regard to BLM, Black lives has not mattered as much as it should have, and as much as white lives for centuries altogether. And I think Black Lives Matter.
Okay, sir. Questions are still pouring in, so we'll try to answer as much as we can in this session. The next question is, the focus on the poor, as forward as it is, can be very one-dimensional. Can it stretch to include or acknowledge mental illness, racism, and sexism? And we can go on. This may not be contextual with the time frame, but I'm speaking from a 2020 viewpoint.
See, again, what is important here is how we define the poor, right? So in one sense, like, I think it's one-dimensional in the sense that people might take it as excluding the rich. So in that sense, it can be one-dimensional. But I take this as a that has to do with emphasis. like it never negates or denies the universal, but in the sense of being one-dimensional in the way that you mentioned here, mental illness, racism, I think all of this can be included in the within the category of the poor, people who are considered not full human beings, non-persons, the subjugated, the marginalized. But again, uh, the concept of the poor, I think, should not be watered down too much to the extent that we end up saying that all of us are poor, as in all lives matter. So I think we need to be careful in that regard.
Okay, so the next question is asked by Mr. Silal Engzama. Where do our theological institutions in Mizoram stands in terms of liberation theology?
I don't know if I'm if I'm the right person to answer this. I can only answer insofar as I was once a student, not as someone who knows the inside workings of the seminaries or the Senate of Serampur. But just my take as a student, I think Senate of Serampur, under which the theological institutions in Mizoram like AICS and ATC are affiliated, the Senate of Serampur, I think, is very much oriented towards liberation theology, and the theological orientation is toward that. So with regard to tribal theology, Latin American liberation theology, Dalit theology, like eco theology, whatever, like we learn all these stuff, and I think it's oriented towards liberation. But at the same time, I think it also depends. Even though the syllabus, the curriculum is centralized from the Senate of Serampur to a large degree, but I think it also depends on the culture and the culture of the individual institutions. So one particular institution could be a little more liberationist than another institution, but I think in one way or the other, most seminaries under Senate of Serampur are leaning towards liberation theology, at least to a certain degree.
Okay, sir. And the next question is from Mr. Matlan Atsangte. Do you believe that theology can bring out the poor from their captivity or the oppressor?
I think this should be. I think we should understand in terms of theology not trying to do the work alone. Like in a context, like let's say in a context where Christianity is the predominant religion, theology would be hopefully would be able to achieve more in this regard. But in a context like India, like Christianity is like a small minority. So I think it's always important to have solidarity with other people who share the same interest. So even across religion, I would say, across caste, across race, we need to think about. I was trying to talk about this in my talk, but I completely missed it. We need to see in terms of solidarity, interdisciplinary solidarity as well, like theology in solidarity with working together with disciplines like economics, political philosophy, or those stuff. So I think it should not be seen as like the sole burden of theologians or Christian theology.
Okay, so the next question is, sir, do you think that the current Mizo-Christian culture is deeply Eurocentric? In other words, is it right to say that Mizo-Christian culture is being very much influenced by Western Christian culture?
Yeah, I think so. Like to put it simply, I think so. But of course, like uh, there's also a number of uh, indigenous elements in Mizo Christianity, I think. Which makes it unique. But I think our theology and many of the Christian culture we have is deeply informed by European theology and missionary theology from Europe.
Okay, the next question is, do Mizoram Church require a kind of structural reformation that happened during Protestant Reformation? Are we moving too much towards prosperity and materialism?
Ah, this is good, but I think it's also a little difficult. Like, yeah, to who, like, what do you mean? What should the structural reformation here mean? Like, it might mean different things to different people, but I think, yeah, there's no denying that whether you call it structural or not, there's a certain degree in which I think Mizo Church, like in terms of its theology or whatever, needs reformation. I think, and are we moving towards prosperity? I find what's going on. Sometimes I find what's going on among us or other Christians around the world like quite contradicting. Is like contradictory. Is like our spirituality, our theology is so much oriented toward the other world, heaven. But even though our theology is solely oriented toward the other world, heaven, outside of this world, the daily life we live is so much consumeristic and materialistic. I find this contradiction quite glaring and I don't know, intriguing.
Okay, the next question is, the church today in Mizoram seems to have drifted away from the church of the poor. In many ways, this drift might have come from the system which has been passed on. Can you give any suggestions or ways for people who are aware and wants to fight against this corrupted system?
Mm, mm. It's difficult, right? I think we start with conversion. Maybe like after hearing all these things, like we start with like conversion, a turning toward God, and not in the sense that we are used to, but supplementing that, turning towards God and toward other human beings. And then I don't think at this point I'm like, I'm ready to give concrete suggestions for action, but I think there should be and there could be a lot of ways to go about, and I think people can get together. Like, let's get together. How do we fight? How do we fight this wrong? So maybe as new groups, or maybe strengthening some organizations that are already there, or like I think there should be ways to do this. But I'm sorry, I cannot give concrete suggestions.
Okay.
I think we missed one just above this.
No,
question.
this is a repetitive question. You have already
okay.
answered. Okay.
Okay.
So we still have 4 more questions to go, and the next question is asked by Ms. Remrote. Do you think God can only be accessed through institution, that is, through religion?
No, I don't think. I think in this sense, I give privilege to God's revelation in Jesus Christ, which which is witnessed most clearly in the Bible. So I give privilege to that when it comes to knowledge of God. Wait, I miss. when it comes to access to the knowledge of God. So I don't think the church or religion as such has monopoly over that. And apart from that, I think I'm Barthian in the sense that if God wants to use a dead dog or a beggar or a communist, whatever tool in this world to speak to us, I think God can use that.
Okay. So the next question is asked by Mr. Songate. Sir, I think you stressed too much on the poor in material sense of the term, but I do believe that Jesus is more focused on spiritual realm. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Can you enlighten me?
This is actually good because this is one of the pushbacks I think liberation theologians face, at least in its initial years, because it seems that in number of instances, the Bible seems to valorize poverty, right? The Bible seems to valorize poverty, blessed are the poor in spirit and stuff. But that being said, let me parse this out in two ways. One is blessed are the poor in spirit. That the one sense that I first would like to mention is that the poor in spirit, I think, could be interpreted as a sort of humble openness to God, like a sort of childlike openness to God and humility to God. So that is one thing, and that sort of poverty is good. That sort of poverty is good, but not in a sense of saying like who wants to be poor, man? Like it's shit, man. It's a shitty experience, right? So we don't want to be poor. So I don't think the Bible is trying to valorize poverty in and of itself. I don't think. I think God wants shalom, wholeness, well-being. I think that's what God intends, and so yeah, there's a good sense of being poor in spirit, but to valorize economic poverty, unless it is done out of commitment to the poor or out of choice, I think it could be misleading.
Okay, we still have two more questions. The next question is from Mr. Anthony Moya. If economical, I think this should be economical. If economical disparity is a sin, then this mundane world, which has been discounted on the pretext that it has less to do with spirituality, should be at the center of theological reflection. So it means that the church must be more conscious of the economic inequality that is rampant in society. Do you think our current church system is doing quite well in uplifting the poor, or are they more inclined towards the earthly glory that you have mentioned?
Yes, thanks for this. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, I think. So one thing is like the spirituality thing, which I think is important. And this is one of the reasons why I keep on repeating that poverty is a theological problem, not simply a socioeconomic problem. So if our understanding of what is theological problem and what is theological is broadened, then socioeconomic problems or economic disparity can no longer remain solely economic concern that is detached from the theological, or solely material concern that is detached from the spiritual. So I think that broadening of the definition of what is theological and a theological problem is important. I mentioned that because you mentioned spirituality there, and going to spirituality, then the understanding of spirituality automatically broadens when we start understanding the gospel and theology in this light. So spirituality is no longer uh, detached from this world. It's a spirituality within this world, for the world, particularly for the poor. And with regard to the current, the church, whether the church is doing well in uplifting the poor, I think Mizo churches and churches around the world, and from the beginning, has deep concern for the poor. Charity is always part of charity towards the poor, is always part of the life of the church. But I think what liberation theology contributed in this regard is charity is not enough. We need to address the system that produces inequity, economic disparity, unjust economic disparity of huge proportions. So, uh, so I think, in one sense, when it comes to charity and pity, I think that the church is doing well, sort of, at least to a certain extent. But when it comes to addressing the structural wrongs, I don't think the church is doing well. And and also the churches, I I think I find it difficult to deny that the Mizo churches are inclined towards earthly glory. Not to say that they are not inclined towards heavenly glory, but the disposition, the inclination towards having glory in this or greatness is like, I think this is really strong.
Okay, so this will be the last question for tonight. The question is, dear sir, what do you think whether the poor really have, I'll rephrase this, I think there is some mistyping here. Dear sir, do you think whether the poor really has a place in the church today, like the way rich and influential member of the church? The church is focusing on evangelism and reaching out to the unreached people, and the poor still needs government and NGOs to support and sustain their living. Why is the church not able to address issues related to poverty?
Um, Let me try to quickly answer the last part of the question. Why is the church not able to address um, issues related to poverty? I think this has a lot to do. This has a lot to do with the kind of theology that we inherit from the West that I have already mentioned or referred to. So the theology we inherited from the West is that kind of theology that is like, that seems to be at least less concerned with the political in this world, the here and the now, the mundane, the everyday, and also the kind of spirituality that is at work among the Mizos. And it would be interesting if we start talking about the Mizos spirituality or religion before Christianity, like the concept of PRL. I'm interested in PRL these days, but we'll not go there. So I think it has a lot to do with the kind of theology that we inherit, and also we develop, we ourselves develop, and I think the kind of individualization, privatization of Christianity also has a lot to do with this. Like, we individualize and privatize Christianity as if it has nothing to do with the world we live in, our everyday life. So I think this is the reasons why we're unable to address the main reasons.
Okay, sir, I think we have answered all the questions. There are 20 plus questions tonight. And I think that our participants are also quite interested in your presentation. And judging from the number of questions that came in during our discussion and looking at the variety of questions, I think your presentation has greatly reflected the secular and the theological aspect that we are trying to reflect in this webinar. So, sir, we thank you for your time again. I know how busy you are, and I think the participants will also benefit a lot from your lectures. And I would also like to thank, on behalf of the organizing team, to our dear participants who have asked questions, not only tonight, but in the previous two nights also. And I would like to request you to please ask questions in the other two sessions that we are going to have in the remaining program of our webinar. So, Reverend Arcia, thank you again on behalf of the organizing team. And we hope and wish you all the best for your future endeavors and in your PhD degree also. And this is for the information of all the participants. Tomorrow we will resume our webinar session at 7:30 again. And the speaker, the resource person for tomorrow night will be Dr. Ayangbam Shyamkishore, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Mizoram University. And his topic of the talk will be monitoring elections, initiatives, and participation of churches in Mizoram. So I would like to invite all of you again to yet another interesting and thought-provoking session tonight. And I hope that tonight's session will enlighten you in many ways as ever before. So I will bid you farewell for now. So I hope to meet you all again tomorrow night for another interesting and enlightening session. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thanks.